Hello and welcome to the Turkish History Podcast. Episode 66. The Kingdom of Heaven. Before we begin, if you have been enjoying this podcast, I'd like to ask you to please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get this podcast. It would mean a lot to me and would help more people find the podcast. Thank you for listening. So last time, we discussed the aftermath of Myriokephalon and the death of Manuel Komnenos, how Kılıç Arslan completed the conquest of Anatolia, but we ended with the Sultanate of Rum falling into chaos as Turkmen unrest combined with an aging sultan to fracture the sultanate. The limping lion now stood at the head of what amounted to a rickety and unstable federation, with civil war already breaking out among the sultan and his sons. The future claimants to the throne in Konya were eyeing each other and their father with increasing suspicion, sharpening their knives as they waited for the elderly sultan to die. And it was while the sultanate was in this perilous condition, as chaos consumed the state ruled from Konya, that a great crusading army, led by the Holy Roman Emperor, landed in Anatolia. And today, we will discuss how that crusading army, the storied Third Crusade, came to arrive in Anatolia. And we will begin with the man who really kicked it off. Not a crusader, but a different sultan. The brilliant Ayyubid conqueror, Saladin. Now to begin, as we have previously discussed, following the death of Nureddin Zengi, Saladin basically immediately declared himself a sultan and moved to take over the former Zengid domains in Syria. Using Egypt as his base, he crossed the deserts of the Sinai and the Red Sea and invaded Syria and Arabia. This initial conquest was largely bloodless, and Saladin was in Damascus mere months after Nureddin's death in 1174. However, it would take the great conqueror about a decade to fully consolidate his control over Syria and northern Iraq. This was accomplished through war and through negotiation. As discussed last time, it also included coming to a deal with Kılıç Arslan II and setting the border between the Sultanate of Rum and the new Ayyubid Sultanate. Simultaneously, Saladin launched further attacks against the outlying fortresses of Outremer. These built on the successes of Nureddin and continued to box the Latins into an untenable strip of land along the Mediterranean. As we discussed last time, Kılıç Arslan threw a wrench into some of Saladin's plans along the marches of Syria and Anatolia. And far more importantly, in 1177, the great conqueror suffered a rare defeat to the leper king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, at a place the Crusader sources called Mongiscard. We don't know where this was for sure, but it lay somewhere between modern Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, which, if you think about it, really shows just how weak Outremer had become. You know, how was Saladin even able to march an army into the area between Jerusalem and the sea? However, in the end, Saladin was able to secure his control over Syria and northern Iraq. A huge milestone was the negotiated surrender of Aleppo in 1183. With Aleppo and its environs in hand, all of the major citadels and fortresses in the interior of Syria were controlled by Saladin, and his rule of the region was more or less locked down. And the road to Jerusalem began to open. Indeed, the Cadi of Damascus reportedly said, "Your conquest of Aleppo with the sword in the month of Safar is a good augury for the conquest of Jerusalem in the month of Rajab." Further campaigns against Armenian Cilicia and the remaining Zengid and Crusader outposts then followed, which ended up securing Saladin's rule over Syria by the mid-1180s. Saladin made a quick trip back to Egypt in 1185 to make sure that his original base of power was in good shape, which of course it was. Indeed, in his absence, one of his generals, a Circassian Mameluke by the way, had taken an army off to conquer westwards, as far as Libya. So with Egypt in hand and even North Africa falling to him, Saladin returned to Syria to complete his consolidation of power and prepare for the great jihad against Jerusalem. Now, in order to prepare the ground for that war, Saladin felt that he had to completely lock down his frontiers to make sure that the leper king of Jerusalem, Baldwin IV, had nowhere to turn for aid. Now, as we discussed last time, the Sultanate of Rum to his north was not going to be a problem. In Konya, the limping lion was old and slipping, and the Sultanate of Rum was consumed by Turkmen unrest. Indeed, in this same year, 1186, Kılıç Arslan II was dividing up his sultanate. And fortuitously, the other great crusading state, Antioch, was also able to be sidelined. Now, if you will recall, Manuel Komnenos had forced Antioch to submit to imperial rule and reincorporation into the Byzantine Empire in 1159. This had resulted in over a decade of vassalage to Constantinople for the principality. But then, two events happened back to back. First, the Byzantine army, including its Antiochian contingent, were annihilated at Myriokephalon. Then, just 4 years later, Manuel Komnenos died, and Byzantium fell into civil war and chaos. All of this resulted in the Principality of Antioch, now ruled by Bohemond III, regaining its independence. But Bohemond was actually not super interested in aiding his Crusader brethren in Jerusalem and Tripoli, and instead he basically cut a deal with Saladin. Therefore, Antioch basically sat on the sidelines as Saladin defeated the Crusaders and the Zengid remnants in Syria. Thus, in 1186, Saladin launched a campaign against the one state in the region that could potentially aid the Kingdom of Jerusalem, Armenian Cilicia. In an alliance with Bohemond III, the Prince of Antioch, Saladin orchestrated a massive invasion of Cilicia to break the Rubenid king's ability to make war in the Levant, and thus complete Saladin's consolidation of power. Indeed, somewhat scandalized that Bohemond had allied with Saladin, Michael the Syrian says, "In the same period, the Prince of Antioch established friendship with Saladin and treacherously hunted Reuben, lord of Cilicia. He seized Reuben and put him in prison. Soon enough, Reuben would be dead, to be succeeded by Levant II, who would eventually declare himself king. But the upshot was that Cilicia was now unable to oppose Saladin or aid Jerusalem and its leper king. The campaign in Cilicia secured Saladin's position in Syria and indeed the Middle East as a whole. His territories now stretched from Libya to Iraq, with all of Egypt and Syria under his control. He was, pretty indisputably, the greatest Muslim leader in the world. Furthermore, politics within Outremer itself were moving in Saladin's direction. As discussed earlier, Saladin had already sidelined the Principality of Antioch. But then, in 1185, Baldwin IV, the leper king of Jerusalem, died of complications caused by his horrible disease. He was succeeded by his brother-in-law, the French knight Guy de Lusignan, but as Guy was not of royal blood, his control over the state was a bit shaky. Saladin reportedly even was able to make an alliance with Raymond, the Count of Tripoli, though it would prove to be short-lived. So by 1186, the Kingdom of Jerusalem was isolated and internally divided and disorganized. It was this internal division within the Kingdom of Jerusalem that ultimately sparked the Great Campaign and the fall of the Kingdom of Heaven. One of the feudal lords of the kingdom, who ruled an outlying area, a fiefdom across the River Jordan, was a guy named Renaud de Chatillon, familiar as the villain in the early 2000s movie Kingdom of Heaven. In 1186, he led an attack on a Muslim caravan, basically massacring everyone, and thus violated the fragile truce that still existed between the kingdom and Saladin. This was a great provocation to Saladin and also a massive opportunity. Saladin had spent years preparing the ground for his great reconquest of Jerusalem, and thus Saladin decided that now was the time to launch this great jihad, the great campaign to reconquer the holy city for Islam. This great jihad, one of the greatest in history, began in 1187. Saladin assembled his armies in Damascus. Ibn al-Athir tells us, this year, Saladin wrote to all his lands, summoning men to the jihad. He wrote to Mosul, the Mesopotamian regions, Irbil, and other places in the east, and to Egypt and all of Syria, calling upon them to engage in the jihad and ordering them to make all possible preparations. Most modern scholars believe that Saladin's army numbered at least 40,000 strong, massive by the standards of the Middle Ages. Once assembled, the great army departed Damascus on April 10, 1187. However, Saladin was not planning on marching straight towards Jerusalem. Instead, the great army moved to key crusader outposts in the Jordan Valley. A detachment was broken off to besiege the citadel of Kerak, to the east of the Dead Sea in modern-day Jordan. But Saladin and his main army continued moving south and west from Damascus, and they descended from the Golan Heights into what is now northern Israel. Meanwhile, King Guy de Lusignan was nearby, in the great fortress of Sephora, famous for its springs and fresh water, and which lies near to the Sea of Galilee. Upon hearing of the news of Saladin's advance out of Damascus, the king had made peace with the Count of Tripoli, Raymond, and had of course amassed a great army, probably around 20,000 strong. This army then moved forward into the fortifications guarding the road from Damascus and the entrance to the coast from Syria. Guy's plan seems to have been to hold the critical fortifications of the region, to stop Saladin from breaking the ring of fortresses that guarded Outremer. However, Saladin did not make a move to attack the Crusader forces in Sephora, or even to bypass the region and move on to Jerusalem. Instead, he ordered the Muslim army to surround and put to siege the nearby city of Tiberias, which lies just to the west of the Sea of Galilee. The news of the siege of Tiberias caused alarm among the Crusaders. Tiberias was a city of critical strategic importance, as it controlled the Sea of Galilee and routes that connected Jerusalem, Nazareth, and the southern and eastern territories of Outremer to the northern territories in what is now Lebanon. It was also of symbolic importance, as it was the residence of Raymond, the Count of Tripoli, and Raymond's wife was in the city when it was put to siege. And then, worse news came to the Crusaders in Sephora. Saladin had not just put Tiberias to siege, but had quickly captured its outer walls, and only the citadel was holding out. Panic spread further in the Crusader camp in Sephora, and therefore the king of Jerusalem decided that he had to do something. And so, fatefully, Guy de Lusignan pulled together his army and began marching out to relieve Tiberias. But all of this was, in fact, part of Saladin's plan. His goal, actually, was not to take Tiberias, but to draw the armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem out of their fortifications, and thus destroy them in the field. In other words, he had picked Tiberias exactly because he knew that besieging it would prompt this reaction. And so, Guy de Lusignan was now basically marching into a trap. On July 3rd, 1187, the Crusader army thus left the springs of Sephora and marched out towards Tiberias. They were harassed throughout the day by Turkish horse archers, riding forth and peppering the army before disappearing. This slowed the Crusader army down, and by midday it was apparent that the Crusaders were not going to be able to reach Tiberias before sunfall. King Guy therefore decided to camp on a small and arid plateau overlooking the besieged city, the now famous Hill of Hattin. With the Crusaders encamping on Hattin during the late afternoon, Saladin sprung his trap. His armies now moved quickly to encircle the Crusader army and cut them off from any source of water. And by the time night fell, the crusading army was completely encircled on the hilltop. Over the night, Muslim raiding parties made sorties to harry the encircled enemy, and Saladin ordered his men to light the dead brush and grasses along the hill alight, and heat and smoke boiled forth, enveloping the Crusaders over the night. When the sun rose the next day, July 4th, 1187, Guy de Lusignan and the Crusader leadership attempted to break out. Several great charges were launched. The Latin continuation of William of Tyre says, "Our men bravely endured the attack of their enemies to the extent that the defiled permitted them to. They fought bitterly on both sides, and many fell dead." But ultimately, the Crusaders were simply unable to resist. Saladin had them surrounded on a baking hot hilltop with no water, and the Muslim forces were able to resist the great Crusader charges and even launch counterattacks. As the day dragged on, it became apparent that the Crusaders were not going to be able to break through, and thus Saladin ordered a great final charge. the Muslim army, composed of Turks, Arabs, Kurds, and Persians, surged up the hill. The parched crusaders proved unable to resist and were overwhelmed. Ibn al-Athir relates that Saladin's son, who was actually there, personally told him that during this charge, "I again shouted, 'We have beaten them,' but my father rounded on me and said, 'Be quiet, we have not beaten them until that tent falls.' As he was speaking to me, the tent fell. The Sultan dismounted, prostrated himself in thanks to God Almighty, and wept for joy." Basically, the entire crusading army, including the King of Jerusalem, Guy de Lusignan, and the great lord, Renaud de Chatillon, were captured, and most Muslim and Christian histories report that Saladin treated his captured foes with all due honor and courtesy. Of the great crusading lords, only Raymond of Tripoli managed to escape. And in an even greater blow, Saladin had captured the kingdom of Jerusalem's most important holy relic, a great cross that was believed to contain a part of the true cross upon which Jesus had been crucified. Indeed, to the Christians, the loss of the cross was considered an even greater disaster than the capture of the King of Jerusalem. The continuator bewailed, "Ancient times produced nothing to be lamented as much as this, because neither the Ark of the Covenant nor the captured King of the Jews can compare to the plights of our time, in which the king was led captive with the glorious cross." Outremer had, in short, suffered its most grievous blow in its nearly century-long history. The Battle of Hattin was one of the most important battles of the Crusades and the greatest victory of Saladin's storied career. Outremer now lay at his mercy, and everyone knew it. With the true cross and the King of Jerusalem in Saladin's hands, and with the great crusading army now destroyed, there was no one in the Levant who could possibly oppose Saladin. Reportedly, Pope Urban III himself died from shock upon hearing of the news of the Battle of Hattin, knowing that this meant that the fall of Jerusalem was now inevitable. For decades, Saladin and his predecessor Nureddin Zengi had strangled Outremer, reducing it to an untenable strip of land hugging the Middle Sea, sustained only by faith and the army of the King of Jerusalem. And now these were gone. The game was up. It was over. One after the other, the citadels and fortresses of Outremer submitted, as Saladin and his armies surged forward throughout the Levant. The citadel of Tiberias fell just a couple of days after Hattin, and the great coastal city of Acre just a couple days after that. Detachments were broken off to seize Nazareth, Caesarea, Haifa, Nablus, and basically every city and fortification in the region, as Saladin turned north to take Sidon, Jubail, and Beirut. Saladin then moved on to Tyre, but the fortuitous arrival of a Latin force, by happenstance arriving at the city at the same time by sea from Constantinople, saved the city from him. Saladin thus then turned south and took Ashkelon, with the city surrendering on September 5th, 1187. Within the space of 2 months, basically all of Outremer south of Tripoli had fallen, with the exception of Jerusalem. Thus, Saladin now turned his forces towards the holy city itself. His army arrived at the walls of Jerusalem on September 20th, 1187. With the armies of the Kingdom of Jerusalem having been either killed or captured at Hattin, there was now no force in the Holy City that could now seriously hope to withstand the might of Saladin. The remnants of the military were led by the knight Balian of Ibelin, now world-famous from an extremely fictionalized portrayal of him by Orlando Bloom in the movie Kingdom of Heaven. Balian had been at Hattin, but had escaped the destruction of the army and fled to Tyre. When Saladin put Tyre to siege, Balian asked him for permission to cross the lines to return to Jerusalem to escort his wife and children to the safety of Tripoli. Saladin had agreed to this, but required an oath from Balian not to raise arms against the Sultan again, which of course Balian kind of broke because once he got back to Jerusalem, he set about organizing its defenses instead of escorting his family to safety. Balian therefore did his best while Saladin encircled the city. Soon enough, massive trebuchets had arisen outside the walls of Jerusalem, and mining works had begun under the walls themselves, while the crusaders inside raised their own trebuchets on the walls. A relentless barrage then commenced, with Saladin ultimately ordering an assault on the walls. According to both Christian and Muslim sources, the fighting was vicious, as both sides were animated by religious zeal. Historians on both sides record that Saladin's trebuchets were able to break through the walls, and the city nearly fell with the great assault. The continuator, for example, tells us, "The savage race destroyed this cross with the blow of a missile, and with it they cast down a not inconsiderable part of the wall. The citizens, for their part, raised what defenses they could, but whatever our men attempted lacked results and did not meet with success." In these circumstances, Balian and the remaining Crusader leadership inside the city knew that there was just no hope of holding Jerusalem. The armies Saladin had assembled were just too massive, and there was no possibility of relief. And thus, an overture for peace was made just a couple of days into the siege, essentially offering to surrender the city if the Crusaders and those who wished to leave were given safe conduct to Tripoli. Saladin at first rejected the terms, saying that he would treat the Christians just as they had treated the Muslims when they had first conquered the city almost a century earlier, something that the Crusaders were horrified to hear because they knew, of course, that the first Crusaders had been absolutely vicious in their sack of the Holy City and had killed, captured, and raped countless people and desecrated the Muslim holy places. However, determined to come to a deal, Balian himself rode out under the flag of truce to negotiate with Saladin. According to Ibn al-Athir, he said that if death were inevitable, then the Crusaders would slay our sons and women, burn our property goods, and not leave you to benefit from it by a single dinar or dirham, nor take captive a single man or woman. When we have finished that, we will destroy the Dome of the Rock, Al-Aqsa Mosque, and other sites, and then kill the Muslim prisoners we have, 5,000 in number. We shall not leave for you any mount or animal without killing it. Then we shall come forth, all of us, against you, and fight like desperate men fighting for their lives. Not one of us will be killed at that time unless he kills many more of you. We shall die nobly, or win victory gloriously." Upon hearing this, Saladin relented. He had no interest in seeing that happen, and in any event, was already becoming well known for the lenient terms he gave his enemies. And so, Saladin and Balian came to an agreement. The holy city was to be turned over to Saladin. Any who wished to leave would be given safe passage to Tripoli in the north for a price of 10 dinars. Balian himself agreed to personally pay the fee for any of the poor who wished to depart. Thus, on October 2nd, 1187, the holy city of Jerusalem was surrendered to Saladin. 88 years, 2 months, and 17 days after its initial fall to the infidel invaders, the holy city was back in Muslim hands. Or, from a different perspective, the kingdom of heaven came to an end. Saladin had earned his place in Islamic history, a place of honor that he holds to this day. Ibn al-Athir reports that the day of its surrender was a day to be remembered, as the banners of Islam were raised on the walls of the holy city. Saladin entered Jerusalem and ordered that the great cross that the Crusaders had erected on top of the dome of the rock be thrown down. Ibn al-Athir tells us that, when they did so and it fell, everyone in the city and outside, both Muslims and Franks, cried out as one. The Muslims shouted, "God is great," in joy, while the Franks cried out in distress and pain. Following the capture of the city, Saladin was good to his word. Those who wished to leave departed, and Saladin treated those Christians who remained with respect and honor. The Latin continuation of William of Tyre tells us that though Saladin returned Al-Aqsa and the Dome of the Rock to Islam, he allowed the Church of the Holy Resurrection and the Holy Sepulchre to remain as Christian holy sites, turning them over to Suryani Christians. The continuator even admits that Saladin allowed members of a Latin order of monks to stay in the city. Saladin's reputation for honor and chivalry in both East and West, one that comes down to us to this day, in large part comes from here, in the contrast that everyone could see between how he treated the Christians after his conquest and how the first Crusaders had treated the Muslims 88 years earlier. As a line of Christians marched forlornly out of Jerusalem towards Tripoli, Saladin mopped up the remnants of the kingdom of heaven. Kerak, Tyre, and the remaining Christian outposts and fortifications were cleared out. Within a year, nothing remained of Outremer south of the county of Tripoli and the Principality of Antioch, and even they were beginning to look more and more doomed. The news of the fall of Jerusalem spread outwards quickly. In the Muslim world, it caused rejoicing and celebration among the Muslims, and lamentation and sorrow among the Christians. But the reaction in Western Europe to the news was shock, fear, outrage, and, perhaps above all, guilt. Pope Urban III's death from shock at the news of the Battle of Hattin was an extreme embodiment of the broader reaction in the West. Though the fall of the Kingdom of Jerusalem had been, in some sense, slowly approaching ever since the defeat of the Second Crusade, I think most people in Europe had not really appreciated that. Jerusalem had been in Christian hands for their whole lives, indeed, for their fathers' lives and their grandfathers' lives. Its fall was, I think, on some level inconceivable to these men. Yet it had occurred. As before, they turned inwards, believing this to be divine judgment for their sins, maybe above all, the sin of not doing more to aid Outremer. And now, determined to repent for their sins, many men demanded vengeance and swore to retake the Holy City. A letter sent to the new pope from the east and relating the fall of Jerusalem really captured the mood, I think. It ended, in part, by saying, "O most clement Father and highest Pontiff, Vicar of Christ, pious Pope, and Lord over the Lord's flock that has been entrusted to you, use your holy consideration and most prudent deliberation to make plans about how to deal with these very grave and unexpected evils, which, with our sins demanding it, have arisen from the just judgment of God." And so it was that the very first action of the next pope, Pope Gregory VIII, was to issue the call for a new crusade. Indeed, the papal bull, called Audita Tremendi, Latin for the terrifying news, authorizing what would become the Third Crusade, was issued on October 29, 1187, 8 days after Gregory became pope and less than a month after the fall of Jerusalem itself. Audita Tremendi, as with the quantum predecessores that launched the Second Crusade, blamed the sins of the Christians for the fall of Outremer. And it called the people to take up the cross as a form of redemption, of penance, and as a form of divine retribution. Redeem the Holy Land for Christ, and thus pay for your sins. The papal bull read, in part, "Give yourselves, give after yourselves, because you, who cannot make even a gnat upon the land, have nothing of your own. We do not say, dismiss, but send us forth in the heavenly harvest which you have, and deposit with him, upon whom the rust does not destroy, nor the worms, nor the thieves dig up and steal. Work for the recovery of that land in which for our salvation truth has arisen from the land, and did not disdain to carry the forked wood of the cross for us." And thus, the Third Crusade was launched. Now, the Third Crusade really is the most storied of any of the Crusades, even more than the First Crusade. This is, after all, the crusade of Saladin and Frederick Barbarossa and Richard the Lionheart. It has left an indelible mark on history and on culture in both the Muslim and Christian worlds. But that said, we're really going to focus on the Turkish part of it, namely, Barbarossa's invasion of Anatolia on the road towards the Holy Land. So now, we're going to close out the episode by bringing Frederick Barbarossa, the Holy Roman Emperor, to the shores of Anatolia. Perhaps unsurprisingly, given the shock and horror in Western Europe at the news of the fall of Jerusalem, the Third Crusade would basically be the best organized and financed crusade. This was primarily because it was led by monarchs, not just noblemen, men who had kingdoms that could back the venture, but also because there was a high degree of coordination provided by the Pope in Rome. Papal legates were set out to act as intermediaries between the Crusader kings, and Rome substantially backed and organized the recruitment drive on the ground. The Third Crusade started coming together basically immediately after the issuance of Audita Tremendi. Indeed, it had sort of started even before that in some ways, as news of the Battle of Hattin rippled around Europe. In January of 1188, with the help of papal mediation, King Philip II of France and the aging King Henry II of England agreed to cease the war that they had been waging since 1186. The kings of England and France promptly declared Saladin tithes, forced taxes and contributions to cover the costs of the coming crusade. However, the kings of France and England would not be the first monarchs to march east. See, King Henry II of England was aging, and everyone knew that it would be Richard the Lionheart who would lead the army east, as the Lionheart had taken the cross in 1187. And at the same time, the struggle between France and England still had to be resolved before their armies could march east, meaning that they would be departing in late 1189 at the very earliest, and realistically, as it turned out, more like 1190. Instead, the Third Crusade would be initiated by the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. Barbarossa had ruled Germany and much of northern Italy as Holy Roman Emperor since 1152. Though of course, remember that the Holy Roman Empire was far, far more decentralized than its name implies. Now in his late 60s, Frederick Barbarossa had spent most of his reign to date as Holy Roman Emperors were wont to do, namely leading massive armies in rampaging around Italy. But the horrifying news arriving in Germany from Outremer over 1187 shocked the emperor, capped by the stunning and gut-wrenching news that Jerusalem itself had fallen to the Muslims, and the nearly simultaneous news of the papal bull. Horrified, but filled with holy fury, the aging Holy Roman Emperor was determined to aid the crusade, and summoned an imperial diet to meet at the city of Mainz in late March 1188. At Mainz, various conflicts within the decentralized and diffuse empire were smoothed over in preparation for a great holy war, and Emperor Barbarossa himself made peace with his longtime clerical enemy, the Archbishop of Cologne. The emperor also met with one of the chief rabbis of Germany and issued an edict, quite enlightened by the standards of the Middle Ages, which ordered for the physical protection of the Jews. Barbarossa had no interest in repeating the massacres of Jews that had accompanied the First and Second Crusades. But of course, the main event was the Holy Roman Emperor exhorting his sprawling and disunited empire to join the Great Holy War, and taking the cross himself. Reportedly, with a dramatic flourish, Frederick laid out to the assembled crowd the horrors that had befallen the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and asked loudly to the enraptured audience if he himself should take the cross, receiving his answer in thunderous applause. The campaign to the east was now officially on. The Latin armies began assembling over the course of 1188 and 1189, though it would take Richard the Lionheart and Philip of France a bit longer, as I said. On April 15th, 1189, the aging Holy Roman Emperor symbolically accepted the staff and cap of a pilgrim, and thus formally began the march east. Modern historians estimate that his army numbered around 15,000 to 20,000 strong, and this was basically just the German part of the Third Crusade. Over the course of the summer of 1189, Frederick's army traversed Central Europe, Hungary, and the Balkans, and finally arrived at the borders of the Roman Empire by September. Now remember, the Roman Empire has not been having the greatest time of it over the 9 years following the death of Manuel Comnenus in 1180. Honestly, things have not been going that well for the Byzantines since Myriokephalon. The Great Defeat and Manuel's death had been followed by basically 5 years of civil war, ending in the accession of Isaac II Angelos, which began the next great Byzantine dynasty, the Angeloi. The empire was, therefore, only now beginning to stabilize. In the words of Niketas Choniates, the transition from winter to spring. The chaos of the civil war had greatly weakened the empire, particularly in Anatolia, as we discussed last time. but there had been other losses elsewhere. Even now, the emperor was trying to reconquer Cyprus, currently held by a holdout member of the Komnenoi. And perhaps more importantly, Normans from Italy had invaded parts of mainland Greece, including Thessaly and Amphipolis, and had even threatened Thrace and the environs of the capital before Isaac had defeated them. This was followed by a Vlach Bulgarian revolt in 1187 in the Balkans that led to the formation of what is called the Second Bulgarian Empire. And maybe even worse, the general sent out to defeat the Bulgarians ended up revolting and leading his armies against Constantinople. This was followed by another revolt in 1188-1189, this time of the Byzantine pretender in Anatolia, the Philadelphian Theodore Mangaphos, who apparently had the support of the future Sultan Khusrev, currently running much of western Anatolia near to Philadelphia, and potentially even the support of Kulich Arslan himself. Isaac was forced to expend a great deal of money and manpower to put these revolts down. And as all of this was happening, Isaac found himself in the middle of a huge religious controversy, the arcane details of which I won't bore you with, but which basically led to rioting in Constantinople and degraded the emperor's relationship with the patriarch and the clergy. Indeed, this theological and ecclesiastical conflict is only going to get worse and will ultimately massively contribute to Isaac's own loss of the purple in the future. In other words, at the same time that the Crusaders were raising their armies, Emperor Isaac was scrambling just to hold his state together. As Niketas Choniates bewailed, not a single year elapsed without bringing some public horror. It was as though the divinity had spun only troubled days for us mortals. The Roman Empire was, in short, not in the same strong position it had been in prior to Myriokephalon. And thus, like his predecessor Manuel, Emperor Isaac was not exactly enthused by the arrival of the Latins. As we have discussed at length previously, there was already a great deal of tension and indeed hatred between Byzantium and the Latins, or between the Romans and the Western barbarians, as the Byzantines would have seen it. Their churches were not in communion, recriminations had flown back and forth, and on the Latin side, there was a deep well of anger at the supposed treachery of the Greeks, the way that the empire had allied with the Turks against the Crusaders in the past. Isaac Angelos was thus utterly terrified of what the Latins could do to his empire if they chose, and rightfully so. He just was not in a position to resist. However, despite the writings of suspicious Latin historians, particularly those who will in the future seek to justify the Latin sack of Constantinople in 1204, the emperor does not seem to have made the same decision as Manuel did when faced with the Second Crusade. Manuel had of course reached out to Sultan Masud and made an alliance. By contrast, Isaac would placate the Latins, negotiate with them to keep them away from the Queen of Cities, and thus hope to ride out the storm. And kind of surprisingly, this strategy sort of actually worked, in large part, I believe, because Barbarossa and Isaac Angelos were, in the end, both committed to making it work. But that's not how things looked from the beginning. Indeed, the arrival of the Crusader army started off just as disastrously as in the Second Crusade. The Latins began raiding the Balkans as soon as they crossed into the empire, particularly around Macedonia, according to Niketas Choniates. And the emperor, of course, ordered the fortresses on the road to Constantinople garrisoned and set Roman armies out to delay the Crusader march. This caused fury and conspiratorial delusions among the Latins, particularly after the rumors spread that the emperor was, yet again, in league with the Turks and Saladin. Ultimately, charges that will lead to 1204. All of this ultimately led to Frederick Barbarossa occupying Philippopolis, today Plovdiv in Bulgaria, in November 1189 and threatening a march on the capital. This caused a panic in Constantinople, and the emperor even began ordering the city to be prepared for a siege. But the two sides ultimately managed to smooth things over during the winter of 1189-1190. Like I said, at the end of the day, both sides were willing to compromise and were willing to find a way to make things work. Thus, a treaty was signed between the Emperor of the Romans and the Holy Roman Emperor in Adrianople in the spring of 1190. According to the treaty, both sides agreed to an exchange of hostages to guarantee good behavior. The Emperor of the Romans agreed to provide supplies to the Crusaders, to provide transport across the Hellespont, and to release certain German envoys he had seized. And most importantly of all, the Holy Roman Emperor refrained from marching towards Constantinople itself. This was, at the end of the day, what had caused the relationship between the Byzantines and the Latins to fatally break down in the Second Crusade. There simply was no way that the Byzantine emperor could tolerate a large Latin army so close to the New Rome, especially now, with the empire in such a weakened state. And thus it was that the crusading army prepared to depart Europe for Anatolia in spring 1190. The Emperor of the Romans breathed a sigh of relief as the crusading army began marching off towards the Hellespont, and not down the road towards Constantinople. Soon enough, the Crusaders were boarding imperial transports and crossing the Dardanelles, landing in Asia. And thus, the Holy Roman Emperor was now on the road to war with the Roman Sultan.